today in this special day where we commemorate the International Women's Day. A special thanks to our panelists, Ambassador Marta Bárcenas, Ambassador of Mexico at the United States, first woman to be Ambassador of Mexico here in this country. So thank you, we appreciate your presence. District Attorney Larry Krasner, thank you very much for taking the time. And Ambassador Carmen Moreno Toscano, Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission for the Advancement of Women at the Organization of American States. Thank you, Ambassador. Also, special thanks to our sponsors, the Pan American Association, the Consular Corp Association, and the Window for the Comprehensive Attention of Women, and also to Perry World House to letting us launch this event here at this wonderful place. Today, as I told you, is a very important day, International Women's Day, but it's important to remember that according to the United Nations, it will take 81 years to achieve parity in workplace, more than 75 years to achieve equal remuneration for same work done, and more than 30 years to achieve a balance between women and men in decision-making positions. On the other hand, 70% of victims of traffic of persons are women. 1 out of 6 women suffer from domestic violence in the world. And despite all this, of every 5 small and medium companies open, 3 are led by women. In Mexico and United States, women are the largest electoral group, and most important, the majority of the DACA students are women. At the consulate, we decided to address the topic today, a very important topic that is access of migrant women to justice, because it's the door that opens to another human rights. The methodology that we will follow is, I will make a brief presentation of the panelists. After that, going from the regional to the local. After that, we will begin our dialogue, and then we will open the floor for your questions in order to finish, if we have time, some conclusions and recommendations. I try to summarize your biography, professional biography. That was really challenging for us, but it's important for you to know who is who here in this panel. Ambassador Bárcenas has a degree in communication science from the Universidad Interamericana in Mexico City, and a degree in philosophy, sum cum laude, from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. She holds a master's degree in international studies, Diplomatic School, Spain, and has a master's degree in philosophy, specializing in political philosophy, also from the Universidad Interamericana. She speaks English, French, and Italian, and has knowledge of German, Danish, and Chinese. She's a career diplomat since 1979 and has been consul in Barcelona, ambassador to the Kingdom of Denmark, non-resident to the Kingdom of Norway, in the Republic of Iceland, ambassador to the Republic of Turkey, non-resident to Georgia, and the Republic of Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan, and more recently as a permanent representative of Mexico to the United Nations agency based in Rome. Ambassador Bárcenas has also served in different key positions at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and has been Mexico's delegate to the United Nations, the OAS, UNESCO, FAO, and other important international organizations, as well as head of delegation in the session of the Forum of Migration and Development. She has participated in multiple international conferences, including the G20 and the World Humanitarian Movement. She's the author of several articles on the conceptualization of security globalization, United Nations peacekeeping operation, the role of civil society in international relations, culture and diplomacy, and Mexico-United States relations, as well as the Agenda 2030. Ambassador Carmen Moreno is an internationalist and Mexican diplomat. She began her work on women's rights and gender equality as a member of the Mexican delegation to the first United Nations Conference of Women in 1960. 1995, and served as a delegate to the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations to establish the Decade of Women, Equality, Development, and Peace from 1985 to 1995. She has since served as the Mexican ambassador to Costa Rica and Guatemala, as well as the permanent representative of Mexico to the Organization of American States. In 2003, Ambassador Carmen Moreno was appointed by Secretary General of the United Nations as Director of the International Research and Training Institute for the Advancement of Women, and in July 2009, she was appointed as Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission of Women of the Organization of American States and continues to serve in that position. She has taught courses and lectures at various universities in Mexico and abroad. She was treasurer and president of the Mexican Foreign Service Association and founder of the Center for Strategic Analysis and International Negotiation. In 1994, the President of Mexico granted her the rank of Eminent Ambassador, making her the first woman to earn such honor. Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Larry Krasner was officially sworn in January 2, 2018 as the City of Philadelphia 26th District Attorney. Before being elected District Attorney, Mr. Krasner served as consul at Greenblatt Pierce Fund and Flores LLC. Mr. Krasner is the son of a World War II veteran. He attended public school in the St. Louis and Philadelphia area and received his undergraduate degree at the University of Chicago in 1983, and his law degree from Stanford Law School in 1987, where he was selected to the Stanford Law Review. After multiple offers of employment in prosecutors and public defenders offices throughout the country, he worked as a public defender in Philadelphia from 1987 to 1991 and was then promoted to the Federal Public Defender's Office in Philadelphia. In 1993, he started his own private practice specializing in criminal defense and police misconduct matters. During his time in private practice, Mr. Krasner tried thousands of cases in criminal and civil court and represented countless defendants and filed more than 75 civil rights lawsuits against the police for corruption and physical abuse. Throughout his 30 years career, Mr. Krasner has also proudly demonstrated a steadfast commitment to social justice, having defended protesters pro bono who were involved with movements including ACTUP, Black Lives Matter, Progressive Cleric with Power, Casino Free Philadelphia, DACA Dreamers, Decarcerate PA, Occupy Philadelphia, Anti-Gun Clergy, with Heeding God's Call, among many others. Thank you to all of you for being here, and I think that we will begin our presentation, as I told you, from the regional to the local. So, Ambassador Moreno, you can go.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. And, happy International Women's Day. Today, as you know, very many women all over the world are in strike, making it obvious what the war on women means for everybody. So the OAS is also, all the women in the OAS are in strike, and officially accepted. But we decided to come here and participate in this important meeting. I think that talking about the rights of migrant women is very important. So it's really a pleasure to be with you, and I think that Ambassador Skerber's invitation was very important to be not honored. For us, it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here at the University of Pennsylvania. And thank you very much for having us here. I came here to tell you a little bit about the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women, also very well known as the Endo-Para Convention, and its implications for the rights of migrant women to live free from violence. The convention was drafted in the Organization of American States in 1994 and has become the Inter-American Convention with the highest number of states by 72. That is, all of the member states of the OAS, except, unfortunately, the US and Canada. In 2019, the convention will celebrate the 25th anniversary. At the time of the adoption in 1994, this convention was very important because it placed the issue of violence against women at the forefront of the hemispheric policy debate, and by consensus of all the member states of the OAS. And since then, it has changed the way in which violence against women is addressed in Latin America and the Caribbean. At the international level, the Convention has guided the development of other international instruments, including most recently the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, which is known as the Istanbul Convention. Why did we need an Inter-American Convention on Violence Against Women? First, because the incidence of violence against women in the world is very high. I know that you have heard that 1 in 3 women will be at some point in their life the victim of physical, sexual, or psychological violence, most often at the hands of a current or former intimate partner. In a recent global report, the World Health Organization reaffirmed the validity of this figure: 1 in every 3 women in the world. A report that we recently released on the implementation of the Belém do Pará Convention, and this was the 3rd hemispheric report. We have all with official information from the governments. And we confirm that in Mexico, 46% of women over 15 years had stated that they have suffered at least 1 incident of violence from their partner in the last 12 months, which is almost 1 in 2 women. In Argentina, over 8,000 women present formal complaints every year for violence committed against them. In Colombia, 37% of women that had been married or in union have suffered physical aggression from their partners or husbands. In the Dominican Republic, 65,709 cases of violence against women were reported, including 3,488 cases of sexual violence. In Suriname, 2,582 women were victims of femicide or were killed because they were women by their partners or ex-partners. Femicide is a gender-based kill of women, that is, killing a woman because she is a woman. And here we have another issue. Violence against women is not always reported, so the official statistics are almost always an underestimation of the violence that is actually happening. Women don't report violence for a variety of reasons, including fear of retaliation, shame, most often in the cases of sexual violence, lack of confidence in public authorities, or because of their emotional ties to the perpetrator, who in many cases may be the father of their children. So all these numbers should be taken with a grain of salt because they don't necessarily represent the reality. The reality is different also for migrant women, who are very less likely to trust authority in their destination country, particularly in their status, if their status is irregular. In addition, if they don't speak the language of their destination country, they may not even have access to information about where or how to report violence. Migrant women are also more likely to be in situation of violence or exploitation in the first place because their situation makes them more vulnerable to these crimes. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we're also worried by the high level of social acceptance of violence against women. A recent study from the Pan American Health Organization found that in Ecuador, 38% of women consider that beating your wife is justified, at least for one reason. In Haiti, that figure is 28%, and in Paraguay, 23%. So obviously, we need to change the way people, not just men, also women, think about violence against women. Related to this general social acceptance is the deficient response to these cases of violence against women, especially from the justice sector. In Bolivia, the estimated rates of attention to women victims of violence is 10 for every 100,000, so that means 0.01%. In El Salvador, between 2.7 and 5% of violent deaths of women were prosecuted and then sentenced from 2005 to 2010. In Guatemala, in 2012, from a total of 7,548 registered cases of violence against women, only 12% reached sentencing. In Rio de Janeiro, 1,822 rapes were reported in the first 3 months of 2013, and only 70 people were arrested. In Chile, 236,417 cases of intrafamily violence were registered in 2004, but only 6% were processed. In Ecuador, only 12% of cases of violence against women registered in 2004 initiated judicial proceedings. We don't even have this type of data disaggregated by whether the woman is a migrant person or not. But let's assume that just as reporting rates are much lower for migrant women, their cases are also less successful within the criminal justice system. So where is justice? A woman can, if she has the courage, file a complaint with the police. But does she ever get any justice in terms of protection for herself or her children, punishment of the perpetrator, or reparation of the harm that was caused? Part of the problem is the limited existence of legal standards on women's rights in the regions, despite a few landmark cases at the international and the inter-American level. Judges have nothing to fall back on to support their arguments, and many are not familiar enough with existing international and national legal frameworks on women's rights to be able to create jurisprudence. We are also tackling a general lack of confidence in the justice sector. In the US, for example, only 25% of physical abuse, 20% of rape, and 50% of stalkings perpetrated against women by their intimate partners are ever reported to the police. And these reporting rates are even lower for migrant women, racial and ethnic minorities, and LGBTIQ populations, which may face additional forms or greater levels of violence and are less likely to trust the judicial sector. There is a problem of inclusion and eliminating discrimination in the administration of justice. Not just gender discrimination, but also the intersection of gender and other forms of discrimination. The situation is still worse if we consider the existence of conflict and insecurity in the country, which is obviously the case for many countries in the region, and one of the primary drivers behind migration. Sexual violence in conflict and instability is a world war problem, not only in formal conflict areas, but also in Latin American and the Caribbean countries that may not officially be in conflict, but that are characterized by many of the same elements, including high rates of interpersonal and gender-based violence, weak law enforcement and justice administration institutions and mechanisms, proliferation of small arms, and relative impunity for acts of violence. In our region, a particular problem related to migration, and one that is exacerbated by transnational organized crime networks, is the trafficking of women and girls for labor and sexual exploitation. So we are trying to work with various government sectors to address and eliminate this problem. There is still an enormous gap, however, between international legislation on the issue, the Belém do Pará Convention and the Palermo Protocol, and laws that are adequately reflect these commitments. Worse, still is the lack of legal recourse and health and other services available to victims of trafficking. So while we have made some very important strides, the biggest challenge we now face is getting from policy to practice. The laws on paper in this region are generally good. After Western Europe, the Americas has the stronger legal framework on women's rights and gender equality in the world. But these are words on paper and meaningless to the lives of women if they are not supported by the political will, services, information, and financial and human resources necessary to ensure their implementation. The Inter-American Commission of Women has worked to call attention to the gaps and the challenges that we are facing in our compliance with the Belém do Pará Convention so that the states are able to take concrete actions to resolve this gap and make that the law works for women, particularly in the area of access to justice, including an effective response from the police, protection of victims as subjects of human rights, judicial treatment that is impartial and free from gender stereotypes and prejudices, and a consistent application of punishment and sentences. So that's our challenges, and what we are going to be working in the coming years from Washington. I want to thank you very much. I want to thank the university for the invitation, and I want to invite you to join in our work to protect women in the Americas to live free from violence. And I want to make a commercial. All the information and studies that we have been able to do and official information on countries, we have about 150 reports of countries on a country-by-country basis, and we have 3 reports on the hemispheric compliance of the Belém do Pará Convention. Is all in our website, and we also have a portal called belendopara.org. So you are welcome to look at the information, to use it. We have some tools, some very interesting developments, and whatever you need, we are also at your disposal. Hilary Anderson here with me works in the OAS, and she, as you will see, is a workaholic. So we know that we can have her answer whatever questions you have. And thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. Congratulations.
Thank you, Ambassador Moreno. The information, the numbers that you have presented are impressive and show us that there are a lot of factors that limit the access of justice for women. So thank you very much. Now I will pass the microphone to Ambassador Bárcenas to talk us about Mexican migrant women here in the United States. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Consul. It's really an honor to be here. And what I wanted to share with you is some very personal experiences that we are having in our consular service in the US and what we have been having also around, not only in the US, but in the consular services that we provide all around the world. And also that how those experiences matches with what I have seen in the international organizations, and just by chance I've been dealing with organizations in Rome that work a lot with migrants, like the World Food Program and FAO. So what we are seeing, and the title of Migrant Women's Access to Justice is fundamental, because one of the issues that we can see is the challenge of silence. The challenge of silence for women. If you go, for example, to talk, and I did in Turkey, I went to the refugees camps in Turkey that were holding basically most of some of the Syrian refugees of the civil war. It's normally, if you start asking questions, are the men that answer. Women will not answer, and it's even difficult to make them participate because there are certain social rules that give the floor to the men, and women will not answer. So you have to let them talk, let them play with their cultural rules, with the social rules, and then you can start approaching the women and ask them a little bit more about how they are feeling, what are the problems they have. And also for them, it's normally much more easier to connect with another woman than with a man either working for UNHCR or for AFAD, the national institution in this. And you would think that it's easy to empathize and to get information, but it is not. You need to be well trained to know what to ask, how to ask, so that you can really identify or not the problems or the patterns that are conducive to establish a case, let's say, of abuse, of sexual harassment, of access to the most, in a refugee camp, for example, in access to go into the shop or to the cards that gives you food, for all the different programs. Especially when there are cash-based transfer systems, to give them the cards to women are one of the key elements to empower them in these refugee camps and in these different situations in which they are not only in camps but in cities. And if you see these, and then you see, for example, the experience of the Mexican women, for example, in Turkey or in Turkmenistan. We didn't have in Turkmenistan, but we did have in Kazakhstan. Or they are totally different. But for example, in Turkey, there was a case that it really caught my attention. There was a Mexican girl who married a Turkish young man who was very religious. So they were living in the southeast of Turkey. And she went to the embassy to get her passport, and there are certain rules of Mexico that we have to comply about the photographs for the passport, like not wearing a veil, for example, because then you cannot see the face. And she didn't complain of anything, and she did everything. She was very happy chatting with us. 2 days later, she called and she said she was going to file a human rights violation complaint. Yes? Why? Because my husband said that you are violating my human rights because you didn't let me take the photograph with a veil. So you see, it was an influence that, and it was a migrant woman, and of course it was very difficult for us, and said, listen, we were complying with instructions that we have from Mexico, and of course we will give you the address of the Human Rights Commission in Mexico, and if you want to file a complaint, you're free to do it. And if we receive different instructions, then we will do things other way. But meanwhile, she was not the one really complaining. It was the husband who was insisting that it has been a situation or a violation of her human rights. Also, I think in my experience and what we have been collecting some data in the protection division of what we do in the embassies and the consulates, the issue of domestic violence is one of the key issues. it is one of the areas in which we have to really exercise the duty of protection of migrants, because domestic violence is key, but it is not easy also for the women that suffers domestic violence to come up front for the reasons that Ambassador Moreno has already listed in. So they are afraid of denouncing the husband or the father of their children. They are afraid of losing the economic support that they have had. They are afraid in many countries of losing the custody of the children. And if they leave the house because of domestic violence and leave their children at home, they are going to lose the custody and they will not be able to fight for them. They do not know how to even file a complaint of either domestic violence or sexual harassment. They are afraid, for example, if they have a case of sexual harassment, a job, of losing the job and losing the possibility of then have an independent economic life. So it is important to tell them and to guide them in the different options that they could have. So this is, I think it's a common problematic. Another problematic that we see a lot, particularly at the border when we visit the detention centers, and this is that the young women normally also will not speak very easily to men, to consuls that are men, and they will be much more open with consuls that are women, and they will tell you stories, of course, of sometimes of rape, of having been raped, having been beaten, having been asked for sexual favors in exchange for, help on crossing the border or finding people, or even call their families to tell them where they are. And it is something that we try to work with the U.S. authorities to avoid this kind of experiences and abuse, but even though there have been few cases, not many, but even some of them have been abused even by security agents, Border Patrol and IC and this. So it is a very complex situation because in general, women in general, they do not know how to approach these challenges, but migrant women in particular, they are 2 times vulnerable. And if the migrant woman is also of indigenous origin, that she doesn't master even the Spanish language, not to say the English, it is even more difficult because they even have difficulties to communicate with the consuls or to tell us because they don't speak Spanish and we don't speak the indigenous languages. Sometimes we are having translators and we're working very hard on having people that can translate from the indigenous languages, but it is, you see even degrees of vulnerability. So there are challenges that I think we have just realized how big they are, also because the patterns of migration have changed very much in the last 20 years. Before, most of the migrants were young men with no families that were looking for a future, but what we have seen in the latest years is the feminization of migration for different reasons. I think because there is a need of workforce also, but also because the women are more prepared also to migrate, to take the challenge, and because they are also academically prepared, even with more education, to go somewhere else. And what we are seeing now, not particularly with Mexican migration, but with the Central American migration that is arriving to Mexico and then to the northern border, is that it's becoming a family migration. And we are still not understanding the reasons. a very easy way of answering that, it's because, of course, some of them have said because of domestic violence in their countries, because of lack of opportunities, because of insecurity, and because they think that if they migrate with children, it will be easier to get access either to Mexico or to the US. But there are also some information, and we were talking about this, that some of these families or women have been enticed to take their children with them to the border and even pay to go, so to change this pattern. And this is something that we are not understanding, but that is presenting a lot of challenges, because you are not dealing only now with migrant women access to justice or to services, but of the whole, the family unit, no? And unaccompanied children, that some of them are women, not the majority, but a high percentage, and they are really vulnerable. If minors are vulnerable, women minors or children are even much more vulnerable. So I would say that we need to work on many parallel tracks. First, to understand better the phenomena of what's going on. And so we are working very closely with think tanks, both in Mexico and in the US, think tanks that do constantly surveys of the migration to identify these changing patterns and what are the needs and why are the patterns changing so fast in the future. Second, we are working particularly at the border, our consulates with the authorities, US authorities at the border, also on an extra activity of protection of this kind of migration, because it really presents challenges that we were not used to. Even on the detention centers and in the shelters were generally not prepared to receive families. And now our shelters in the northern border of Mexico are totally overflowed. We cannot deal with more migrants. So when the US authorities tell us, listen, we are returning to you the people that are claiming asylum, implementing Section 235, because we don't have the capacity to deal with these numbers, our answer is say, we don't agree with your unilateral decision, and if you don't have the capacity, just imagine if in Mexico we have it. I mean, we have even less capacity. So what we are doing is receiving some of them based on humanitarian reasons, because that is the instruction of our president, to deal migrants with a humanitarian view. And but also in the consulates, we are trying to introduce and reinforce a gender perspective in the work of the consulates. And I want to especially commend Consul Alicia Kerber here, because she was the one with the idea of establishing a special window for the integral attention of women at the consulates. So with a very special methodology to talk with women and ask them how is the situation on health, on education, on family relations, on violence. And the experience in Philadelphia was so successful that now we have this window for the special attention of women in the 50 consulates of the US. So thank you, Alicia. And there is an increasing interest of senators that confirm me as ambassador, and they will talk to the new consuls in the US about including this gender perspective agenda in all the consulates, in the way we deal with the Mexican community, in the way we deal in protection, in the way we relate with the US authorities to tell them how important it is for Mexico to have this gender perspective. And I'm sure that we will also change how we collect data and statistics from the consulates, because sometimes they were not very precise. And the other issue that is worrying us and is all this anti-immigrant rhetoric, because it is really erasing some of the worst instincts in certain sections of the population. And we were not even used to try to get data on hate speech or hate crime. I mean, we knew some cases, but not as consistent or going on. And we're trying to work on that because we have always, with all the problems and the challenges that undocumented migration presents both to the US particularly, but to Mexico, we have always seen in the US a generous and open country. And what we are seeing is a change of attitude in certain sectors. And it is very worrisome because it is not good for the migrants, it is not good for the migrant women, but it is even worse for society because it is not conducive to an harmonious society and to a cooperative society. And if the language, if the rhetoric is accepted as normal, then it will reflect also later on in a violent conduct that would be accepted as normal. And we know that we need to work that with that perspective, both in Mexico and the US, to avoid this kind of language and relationship and even acts of hate. So I would say that for us is absolutely paramount that we continue to work very closely in our network of consulates in the US, which is the largest in the world by far, and with all US authorities, because the most important allies to guarantee access to justice to migrants, to migrant women, to migrant indigenous women are our cooperation with US authorities. But it is also fundamental, as I said today in a message that I sent to all my compatriots here in the US, it is very important that the Mexican community works together, that we keep our unity, that we know that we may be going through difficult times, but that we have to be proud of what we have been doing in our country and that we have been doing in the US, that the Mexican contribution to the US is fundamental in all areas, in the economic, social, and cultural area, and that we should not be afraid of saying so, and not be afraid of being so proud of saying so, and saying we have been contributing to this country in the citizens of Mexican origin, the legal residents, and even the undocumented population. And at the same time, we will be working very hard in Mexico because, as our president has said, we don't want Mexicans to migrate anymore. We need them in Mexico. We need you. We want to work also with the ones that are returning to give better opportunities, to take advantage of their biculturality, their bilingualism, that binational, because those citizens are the citizens of the future that will build this common future for the US and for Mexico. So if we can work together on that, I think we will be successful. And I know trade is very important, treaties are very important to be ratified, investment is very important, but above all, people are important. And if we work together on people, on women, on children, on families, and if we have the same values, the same respect for the dignity of the person, we will build societies and we will continue to have societies that could be an example to the world. So thank you very much for having me here, and thank you to Alicia.
Very much, Ambassador Bárcena. You have touched all the points that we were expecting to make you some questions. You will leave me with no questions now. I'm going to try to invent them. But something very important that you say was the approach that everybody needs to know how to approach somebody that is suffering from domestic violence. And in that point, I would like to highlight that all the consulates of Mexico, the personnel that works in the documentation area has been trained to have that type of approach. So pass the word, tell the woman, Mexican woman, that they can come to the consulate. We know how to detect who is suffering from domestic violence, how to give them the proper attention. Without the husband knowing anything, we can give them the support. Larry, I will pass you now the microphone to talk us about the advances that Philadelphia has done in this field.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like you all to know I'm feeling a little intimidated. Up here, listening to these extremely intricate and complex and nuanced discussions of what it means to be a vulnerable victim, especially in this context, a woman, and especially in this context, someone who is an immigrant and potentially undocumented and may even be suffering from other things that make it difficult to participate in the courts, such as language barrier or age, a barrier because of age. So I really appreciate hearing what Ambassador Bárcena, Ambassador Moreno, and Consul Kerber have to say on these topics. I'm not quite sure how I made the cut, frankly, but I will see what I can do to shed a little bit of light on this. You know, I think when you think from the law enforcement perspective, and I would note, by the way, that our police commissioner is sitting right here in the second row, which should be a reflection of how seriously he takes the issues that are being raised today, and I take them just as seriously. When you think of it from a law enforcement perspective, it is the rights of victims, and it is the protection of women from all sorts of different criminal activity, including the complexities of dealing with criminal activity in a relationship and how to address that. But it's more than that, because when a United States citizen is robbed somewhere in Philadelphia, the witness to that robbery may very well be a woman who is undocumented and who is needed by the prosecution, by the police, in order to solve the crime and in order to bring the robber, who may very well be an American citizen as well, to justice. When the defendant is a person in a case who is an immigrant, maybe even an immigrant woman, it's important that that defendant comes to court so that there can be accountability and there can be a proper resolution of the case. And of course, one of the things that we are seeing in the United States in the year 2019 is that the federal government has created a climate in which it is very hard for immigrants and for women to participate in the court system. That is, needless to say, a very, very dangerous situation, because when you create a group of community who are not able to participate in the court system, then the laws no longer apply. There are egregious, horrifying examples of this. If we look back at the history of what, I mean, I hate to raise the point, but of what some serial killers have done in some places in the United States, where they would specifically select women and they would select sex workers, and they would often also try to select ones who were immigrants because they felt that these were targets and that they could get away with those crimes. Those are not mistakes that we want to repeat. So a lot has been done in this city by the mayor, by the police commissioner, and also I think by my office to try to make that situation better. We can't make it all better. We are in fact living in a patriarchy. We are in fact living, a number of centuries into human development, and we know that there is an imbalance of power and there's unfairness and there's oppression. We get that. But we can at least, as they say in the medical profession, try not to do more harm, and we can at least try to make it more possible to have participation. So let me speak just for a moment about that. Since beginning my position as the district attorney in Philadelphia, which was in January of 2018, my office has made several efforts to help ensure that everyone is able to participate in the criminal justice system. We recognize that immigrants and victims of abuse face particular challenges, and they need support to address those challenges. Many immigrants are scared to participate in our criminal justice system because they are fearful that they or their loved ones will be deported, and that fear is real. The 3 cities in the United States, according to my data, 3 large cities where it's the worst are Philadelphia, Atlanta, and Chicago at this time. And overwhelmingly, the people who are being subjected to deportation are not convicted of crimes. They are swept up in ways that are frankly unprecedented in terms of the actions of the federal government. ICE arrests have increased by over 40%, and since the election of Donald Trump, even those with no arrests are being targeted. Every day, immigrants are hearing and feeling attacked. A good and frankly painful example of this was when the Attorney General of the United States stated that anyone seeking asylum will not be protected and will be deported. In June of this year, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions intervened in a domestic violence case and reversed an immigration appeals court ruling that gave asylum to a Salvadoran woman who had been sexually, emotionally, and physically abused by her husband. You get that?
Yeah.
She's the victim. She's been abused. She's trying to participate in the courts, and the Attorney General of the United States wanted to make sure she did not get asylum. That's stunning, frankly. And there's little doubt as to why we are seeing more and more people who are fearful of deportation not coming to court. The result was intended by what the Attorney General did. But there are things that we can do and have done to support immigrants, and in particular, immigrant survivors of domestic abuse. We can work with community partners to provide support and resources to persons who need to testify in court, including accompanying them to court and giving them language access. We also build community partnerships to help build trust and improve relationships between immigrant communities and law enforcement. In my prior career, before I was a prosecutor, I was a criminal defense attorney and a civil rights lawyer, and for a lot of different reasons, at certain times about 40% of my clientele was Spanish-speaking. I even spent 5 years working as the criminal liaison counsel for the Consulate of Mexico. So I got to see from the perspective of those individuals the situation that they were in. An awful lot of immigrants are here not understanding our court system, not understanding the difference between the prosecution, the police, and ICE. They don't necessarily understand what they're facing, and so it is much more fearful to go to court when you have no idea what happens when you open that box. So these relationships of trust, this ability to explain to immigrant populations, to women in particular, what they're going to face when they go to court can make a huge difference in their ability to participate in courts. Last year, a 10-year contract between ICE and PARS, which is a data system that provides information on criminal cases, was broken. And it was broken because the mayor voted to break it, and because I voted to break it on behalf of my office. It was broken because it was being used as a shortcut by ICE to expedite the deportation and the arrest of immigrants, whether they were showing up. I mean, the truth is they were not supposed to be using it to go after witnesses and to go after victims, but there were instances when ICE did that. They were certainly using it to go after defendants and not even waiting until there was an outcome from the case. I actually represented a man who had a 100% solid defense showing that he was not the person sought, including video and everything else. He was grabbed after he left court and was deported without even being able to resolve that case. So that's unacceptable. I mean, we have to have a system where the police and the prosecution are able to protect communities, a system where we're able to protect U.S. citizens by accessing the testimony of members of those vulnerable communities. We also provide UNT visa certifications. For those of you who know what that is, essentially it's an immigration designation that allows you some protection because you're assisting law enforcement or because you're a victim in certain respect. One would think this would be basic, right? We don't really want to just deport our victims, but obviously in this climate, it's something that we need to do more aggressively, be more serious about. I also hired Caleb Arnold, who is here. Caleb is waving right now, to start a first-of-its-kind in Philly Department of Immigration within the DA's office. And this was modeled off of something that Eric Gonzalez, the district attorney in Brooklyn, did in April of 2017, where we review all the cases where immigration status is known to see if there is a just outcome on a non-serious case that won't result in deportation. And what I mean by that is this: if we feel like the immigration outcome is disproportionate and unfair in light of the criminal matter itself, then we will intervene and try to come up with charges that are just as serious and accountability that is the same, but modify the charges in a way so they won't have these devastating immigration consequences. We also advise the staff on best practices in terms of making sure that immigrants who may be entering into a guilty plea or going to trial are fully advised of the consequences of whatever decision they're making, because often the criminal defense attorneys are not well-versed in immigration. And the U.S. Supreme Court has been clear that the consequences of a criminal conviction for an immigrant can be so devastating that the defendant has to be aware of these details. Finally, we created a policy on these practices to protect the rights of immigrants, and we trained our 300 prosecutors in the policy and did so at length. It was actually a very long process. It's one of the more difficult policies to imagine, because you have to imagine it for every conceivable charge and for every different division. And this is a city where there are 40,000 cases that go through the DA's office a year. So it took quite a bit of time, but we think it is an important policy. And I can tell you that even now, there have been hundreds of cases where we have taken a close look to make sure that we're doing everything we can to protect vulnerable communities of immigrants, including and especially immigrant women. We will continue to do all we can to protect our most vulnerable citizens and to ensure they're able to participate as witnesses or complainants in the criminal justice system.
I think that these cases, when these cases appear in the news, when the asylum is rejected to a victim of domestic violence, the intention is to create that type of fear so that people don't come and present their cases to the authorities. And that is the worst thing to do, not only for human rights, but for the access of justice to women. I would like to present you now a little video that we made to one of the victims of domestic violence that came to the consulate with the devastated situation of domestic violence, as I told you, that was affecting not only her, but her family. She was psychologically not in the well place to be. So we began to work with her at the consulate, and after working with her, providing all the services, legal attention, medical attention, psychiatric attention, you will see the change on her. So please, if we can present the video. With some volume, I think.
Inicialmente vine al consulado a pedir información acerca de la ventanilla Migrant para la mujer, porque tuve un caso de violencia familiar. Las señoritas que me atendieron me asesoraron acerca de todos los programas que podrían ayudarme a hacer con los abogados, tanto para ver lo de mi divorcio, migración, para acudir a un psicólogo también. Me dieron muchas oportunidades para poder ayudarme a mí misma. Ahorita, después de que ya pasó el tiempo, me siento muy bien, me siento excelente, gracias a todo el apoyo que me brindaron en el consulado y en la ventanilla de la mujer. Me siento más fuerte y estoy aplicando para un trabajo mejor aquí también. Yo les diría a todas esas mujeres que no tengan miedo a el que dirá la gente y el que van a hacer solas, porque nosotras las mujeres tenemos mucho que dar y mucho que demostrar, que no debemos de dejarnos maltratar por ningún hombre, y que la diferencia entre cómo yo vivía a cómo vivo ahora, pues me está gustando mucho cómo ha sido todo el cambio y toda la superación que he tenido desde que he empezado desde que terminé mi relación con esta persona. Ha sido muy diferente. Entonces sí se puede tener una mejor vida sin maltrato a la mujer, solamente es cuestión de que nosotras queramos. Nosotras somos valor, poder e inteligencia, también somos inteligentes, así que no debemos de dejarnos maltratar por ningún hombre.
These are the cases that we see on daily basis at the consulate.
Inicialmente vine al consulado a pedir información acerca de la ventanilla Buy.
I think that we want you to keep it in mind. That's why we were repeating it. But now we will pass to some of the questions that we prepare according to the expertise of our panelists. So I will begin with Ambassador Marta Bárcenas, that even though you break my questions, that I will try to. But what do you think are the main cares that are needed by the Mexicans in their communities here in the United States, by Mexican women? The main needs.
The first needs. Well, I think in a more public policy way, as I said, it's that we have a gender perspective in the consulates, because there is not an established public policy on gender perspective on the consulates, so that all the 50 consulates known, and not only the consulates that are headed by women, that they need to deal with the gender perspective and the women. I think that what women need also, it's one of the main areas is legal advice and psychological advice. So we work very closely with a lot of NGOs and with different programs that we have lawyers that assist us in pro bono basis, in other kind of counsel. But I think we need, and we have been even receiving instructions from our foreign ministry, we need a minister to enhance the network of lawyers that advise the Mexican consulates, and not only on immigration cases, but in these cases of, for example, domestic violence or sexual harassment at their job places. So working very hard on that, and maybe even considering to work more closely with health centers and on psychological health, psychiatric health, so for women, and not only for these very dramatic cases of domestic violence or sexual harassment, but even for advice on everyday basis on how to deal, for example, with growing children, with children that came maybe or as very young to the US, and now they are growing as teenagers, and they don't feel where they belong, if they are Mexicans, if they are Americans, what is their future, particularly if they are children of undocumented parents. What I have been listening from different consulates here, San Antonio, and other consulates at the border, is that we are having psychological crisis or a depression crisis with children, because with all this rhetoric that immigration is bad, that you are a criminal if you are undocumented, if you are an illegal alien, which, by the way, I have always told the Americans, we respect your language, but the people is not illegal. The act can be illegal, but not the persons. And listen, alien, we are not ET. We're your neighbors to the south. I mean, it's not ET from home. No? So it's not that. But they were telling me they are having depression crisis in schools because the children feel that they are not worth it of attending a school, that they are not worth it of having a normal childhood. They don't want their parents to go to PTA conferences because they are afraid that their parents will be raided and deported, and because they also feel ashamed of their parents if they don't speak the language or this. So I think we would need to strengthen much more our work with authorities and with universities, specialized centers on psychological attention, because it is not easy. Even some of the dreamers were telling me, you know, Ambassador, we, the Dreamers, that we are fighting, and we are fighting now basically at local level because we're trying to keep the 26 states that give us access to higher education, to keep that law, and that other states pass law that give us access to education. But the younger generation that is coming after us, the younger people like 15, 16 years old, they have not lived through this dreamers process, de los soñadores, and they do not have the psychological strength to deal with issue.
Yeah.
And so I think if just for listening and what I have listened today, I think we need to strengthen our network of lawyers and works with lawyers, but also, and very much more, but much more with psychological attention.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador. Sorry.
There's also an epidemic of autism among
It's significant. Thank you for telling us that. We have to take note of that.
Yeah, to develop some kind of program
Some
that
kind
can
of
help
program
them.
for autism, yes. Fíjate, eso no había pensado.
Hi, I just want to announce, I'm Michelle Pistone, I'm a professor at Villanova, and I've been teaching there for 20 years. I represent asylum seekers, I'm an immigration lawyer. And I'm basically starting a new curriculum to train people who are not JDs, but who can represent immigrants in immigration court and before the Department of Homeland Security. So we're trying to react to the need for lawyers and advocates in the justice system by creating an online interdisciplinary program that talks about psychology. Two of my students are here now today. We're in a pilot program right now, but we hope to launch it soon. And it's exactly to address the issue that you're talking about access to justice.
Thank you so much. So if you don't mind, can we continue the dialogue and afterwards open the floor for the questions of the audience, if it's okay. You talked something really important, that is having more women consulates, and this is not because I'm cheerleading for the woman, but we have seen that whenever there's a woman heading a consulate, the number of the cases of protection giving support for women increases considerably. Just to let you know, here at the consulate, the cases where we were able to help women increased 200% in 1 year. That sounds significant. So yes, we need more women.
We need more statistics of the
We
rest
need
of
more
the
ambassadors, women in the United States. Larry, I will not ask you something very concrete. In what ways have new policies and focus on community safety as opposed to incarceration directly affect access to justice for migrant communities?
Well, some of it is what I was speaking about earlier, but I can be a little bit more specific, I guess. There's a lot of fear of law enforcement in immigrant communities, and it's only grown because of the fear of ICE enforcement, the threat of deportation. Just to place this in context, when I was a practicing attorney and I was in court a lot, essentially ICE would go after defendants who were charged with really serious stuff, real bad stuff, very violent stuff, tons of drugs, that sort of thing. That has changed completely. The criminal justice system, in my view, is simply being used as a collection system, and a collection system in the worst kind of way. What I mean by that is that this administration is just as happy to deport you if you have no criminal case whatsoever as if you are charged with, a terrible stabbing or something of that sort. And so it got to be so bad in Philadelphia that because ICE had access to our criminal database, which would contain descriptions of criminal activity, it would contain addresses, things of that sort, what they would do initially is they would look not just for defendants, they would look for witnesses, they would look for victims, and then they would do things like take the address of, let's just say, the defendant, who they knew to be someone who's undocumented, and sweep that building or sweep that neighborhood. It was that bad. It was just a total scorched earth approach with no regard whatsoever for trying to make sure that communities have access to law enforcement. And that's why it was so important for us to break off the contract with ICE. They can still actually get this information, they just can't get it instantaneously. It takes them a lot more effort, and frankly, when you're dealing with an administration like this, which we will have to deal with for probably only another 21 months, but when we're dealing with an administration like this, I see absolutely no reason why local law enforcement would assist in something that fundamentally corrupts and undermines the capacity of the criminal justice system to protect people and to hold everyone equally accountable. Our Immigration Council, Caleb, has been pretty aggressive at working with victims and survivors to pursue U visas and other forms of protection so that we can protect those communities. And, we all have to recognize that deportation is really very destabilizing for a whole community. It's destabilizing for the entire family. I have seen cases where, it's just sort of this accumulation, this compilation of bad policy. I'll just give you an example from when I was an attorney. Hardworking contractor, family man, undocumented immigrant, living in Allentown, not that far from here, in a community of similar folks. American criminals figure out that this community is populated by undocumented immigrants, and they decide these are good people to rob because they believe in that area the police won't be called. And so they do that, come home after a 13-hour day, try to take your circular saw out of the back of the truck and put it inside the house so it won't get stolen from the truck like last week, and there's somebody there with a broken bottle or a gun or whatever it is who's there to take your cash pay away from you because, that's the nature of the life, right? So then what happens? Well, then what happens is that the immigrant folks who are being victimized don't go to the police because the prosecutor in that area, and it was not Philadelphia, would do those bad things. The police would call ICE in that situation, so he gets a gun. He gets a gun. Now you've got a community of people who are forced to live a lawless life, where they are violating the law by obtaining the gun. They're walking around with loaded weapons, which is never a particularly good idea, and they're preyed upon by American criminals who are completely unaccountable. Well, thank you very much, federal government. That was some nice work, and it all ended very well. We can't. That's unacceptable. We can't do that, and therefore, at many, many different levels, we have to make sure that there is no group of people who are such pariahs that they're unable to access the court system and they're unable to be brought in to assist in normal matters of resolving criminal activity.
Thank you so much, Larry. It's really important. Ambassador Moreno, how is the CIM, the Inter-American Commission, working in order to introduce the gender view into the norms in the region, into the law of the region? Because we know that many of our countries, the law in many of our countries has been written by lawmakers that are male. So is there a neutral view in law or not?
Well, we just listened to Larry, and he has made very important examples of the difference and what you do when you have a gender perspective. Well, we work from the perspective of human rights. So our main concern, main preoccupation is to have everybody's human rights guaranteed. And we give cooperation to the different governments so they can change their legal frameworks. When the Belén do Pará was established, no one had a law against violence against women. Now we have general laws in more than 20 countries. That means the right of women to live free of violence, these general laws. And we also have specific laws against femicide. And we are trying now to have laws against political violence against women that work in politics, because in Latin America, the new issue is that as more women come into politics, more violence against them has started and developing. So we have now an inter-American model law against this type of violence, and also an inter-American model law against femicides. So we try to help them establish the legal framework, because as you know, you need some laws first, and then law enforcement. But first, we need that everybody has a law. So yes, we're trying, and we are also giving some training to judges, prosecutors, attorney generals, and so on, so they can apply the gender perspective in their rulings and in their analysis, because they are not trained for that. And then when they have a case of a raped women, they start, well, you were dressed like very funny, or very, what were you looking for? And that's a very negative way. So we are telling them that women have the right to dress as they wish, and nobody has the right to rape them because of that. So we are trying to educate a lot of people, not a lot of success, but a little bit, and we're trying to get them into the idea that women should have the same rights that men do, and that they should be able to exercise them as men do, just in an equal basis. So we're doing that.
No. Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Bárcenas, we know that Mexico works very closely with the Inter-American Commission of Women. Now we are facing a new administration in Mexico. How is this new administration facing the gender perspective in all the programs, in its programs?
Well, I would start saying that the new administration has a new approach to human rights policy. I mean, Mexico has subscribed to many international instruments on human rights, but maybe we were not applying them or enforcing them as we should. So the new administration came with a new approach and saying, for the first time, recognize publicly that there are 40,000 disappeared people in Mexico. 200,000 internally displaced people, which was something that was denied by previous administrations, that there were displaced people because of violence in Mexico. And the new administration has recognized these issues. It has established a new truth commission to find the truth on Ayotzinapa, and it will reopen the investigations, the criminal investigations on the students' disappearance. And in that context is that you can analyze or not the new gender policy. I think what they have said, we have also recognized and let work in Mexico the UN Committee on Disappearances, that we were not allowed, we didn't allow them before. The Vice Minister or Undersecretary for Human Rights was at the OAS recently, just telling all these new policies. And my president has said several times that for many years we were, and I would say it in Spanish because I don't know the real translation, candil de la calle y oscuridad en la casa, light on the streets and darkness at home, and that he doesn't want to follow that policy. So to solve things, we have first to recognize that we have problems and not deny the problems. So we are recognizing the challenges that we have with the students in Ayotzinapa, with disappearances, with internally displaced people, with violence in Mexico, and with the extension of the activities of organized crime that are really in many places, and not only dealing now with drug trafficking, but with illicit traffic of people, with illicit traffic of women for labor and for sexual exploitation, with illicit traffic of gasoline. So this fight against corruption with a new human rights policy is a key explanation of the new government. Are we going to listen and see very bad things? Oh yes. We are going to see and listen very bad things that maybe did not come into light before, but it is the first step to improve things. In that sense, I think the president has a very clear perspective on gender. Half of his cabinet are women. It's the first time that is a situation. It's 38% of Congress are women. But 48 now, yes, 48, sorry, not 38, 48% of the Chamber of Deputies are women. There are very strong commissions on gender, both in the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. He has just recently designated the head of In Mujeres, the Mexican Institute for Women, and she's an expert, a UN expert, of course Mexican, but working for UN Women for many years. She was the head of the office in Brazil, if I'm not mistaken. No, Carmen? Mm-hmm. And of course we are trying to work very closely. There are challenges because one of the changes that the president is implementing is that there were a lot of funds going through many sectors and activities, like, for example, shelters to protect women from domestic violence, guarderías, daycare centers, and this. But they are reviewing the whole system because a lot of the money was not really benefiting the beneficiaries, but it was staying with the intermediaries. And in this adjustment process, of course, we will have problems, and there have been a lot of criticism, and I personally think that it's right criticism. The criticism is correct because even if we change the system, we cannot damage people in changing the system. So I hope that with the new head of In Mujeres, she will be able to deal with this and make the proper recommendations based on the experience that she has had. And I think also that even my nomination as the first female ambassador to the US is a signal, and that the nomination of several women as head of consulate generals in the future. And I can make it public because it have said, unfortunately, Philadelphia will lose one of the best consuls that we have because she has been nominated as consul general to Houston.
Thank you. Yeah.
So it is public. It's already on the press bulletins.
It's in the press.
But this is also a signal that Mexico wants to give relevance on gender policies. But we have a lot to do. We have the legal framework. We have to implement it better, and we have to work with all these new approaches. But gender policy has to go hand in hand with human rights policy.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Ambassador. Larry, do you think that being Philadelphia a sanctuary city or a welcoming city and finishing with the PARS program has been an asset to really give immigrant community access for justice, or is much more to be done?
Well, I would like to point out Philadelphia is much nicer than Houston. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. Houston is nice, but Philadelphia is nicer.
Thank you so much.
So please think long and hard about your next one. Has it made a difference? Yes, I think it has made a difference at two levels. One level is this was really a struggle between local authorities and the federal government as to how coercive the federal government could be. What was at stake was the feds were saying, either you, city, Philadelphia police, DA's office, help us to speed up deportations of all these people, or we're not giving you some money. And it was over $1 million that was, to come to the city for normal law enforcement purposes. So there was a long period of litigation, a lot of strategizing around it and discussion of how to fight back. And fortunately, as of now, the city of Philadelphia has won. And no, the feds cannot coerce the locals into acting just the way the feds want them to act by refusing to provide money. That's a really, really, really important decision, because on the occasions when the feds have been able to do that, they get what they want. You might notice your speed limits in some states in the United States, which were actually controlled by the federal government's ability to deprive highway money to certain states where they didn't agree with sort of a universal speed limit. All that's changed a bit now, but that's just an example of that. So I think at that level, it was important. But I also think at the level of the streets, at the level of people who live in the city, it has been important, because yes, Univision is covering the fact that the city employees will not call ICE in almost every circumstance. They will not call ICE. If you need city services, maybe you need victims services, maybe you need some help with feeding your children. Maybe what you need is that your trash hasn't been picked up in a month. The city is set up now so that if a person who's undocumented seeks out those city services, city employees are not to call ICE and try to identify them. Some of that was going on before. Some of that was going on in the Philadelphia DA's office before, but it is against the Philadelphia DA's policy anymore to do that sort of thing. So I think when Univision covers this issue and the message that is disseminated in the Spanish language throughout the community is that the city's not going to help Donald Trump do what he wants to do. The city's not going to hurt you for walking in the office, the district attorney's office, or for calling the police if someone is victimizing you, or for coming forward as a witness. When that message gets out there, I think it is helpful. I think it is reassuring. The reason, though, that this matters the most is that the feds are full of all kinds of huff and puff, but they just don't have the boots. A lot of people don't realize this. 93% of criminal prosecution in the United States is done at the state and local level. It's only 7% that's done by the feds. And while I'm sure in the first days of his administration, if Donald Trump had his way, his Panzer tank would have rolled over the whole country and we would have had massive deportations of a style we haven't seen since, 1940s Europe. I'm sure if he'd had his way, that would have happened. He simply couldn't ramp up. He simply couldn't have enough boots out there to do all of that. And needless to say, at this point, he's lost quite a bit of momentum. So, like I said, 21 months to go. I think, things will be looking better soon enough, and especially with Democratic control of the House. The reality is that bad as this period has been, with municipalities pushing back, with our ending the contract to provide PARS information, which is, again, this documentation that allows them to seek and destroy people who are undocumented. What we're seeing nationally is that he's had an impact, but not nearly as much of an impact as he would have liked. And it is reassuring on the street to people to know that cities were sanctuary cities, which Philly is, and that they pushed back.
Yeah, and I think that our community has felt that Philadelphia offers them a safe place to be, and that's why we have this wonderful relation with your office that allow us to present the cases in an easy way with Caleb. Thank you very much for your support, by the way. Just one last question that I would like to raise to the three of you is, do you think that in the Foreign Service, at the OEAS, and in the lawmaker position, there is equity in the number of women participating in public decision posts?
A short answer, no.
Definitely no.
We're trying. We have already approved the gender policy in the Organization of Migrant States, but it reflects what happens in very many countries. At the lowest level, there are more women, and the higher you get, the less women you get. So the efforts are trying to convince everybody that you should have women in decision-making places, in the small boardrooms, in all the high positions. And this has been supported now by the government of Canada, and they have supported us to have an Inter-American task force integrated by all the different institutions that deal with gender issues in order to stress the importance of women in leadership. And we're trying to get into that because I think it's as Bachelet says, when one woman gets into politics, she changes. When many women get into politics change. So we want politics to change.
Yeah, Yeah, that's true, Ambassador. Let's move forward. No, but I remember that at the OAS, every year it's presented a resolution asking to have more equity at the OAS, and still nothing moves.
Well,
as
we
would
are
like.
getting there.
Ambassador Barson, as I know, how do you see the Foreign Service? But thank you for I know that behind my promotion was your suggestion, so thank you so much.
Right. No, I think in general we have a challenge still in the international institutions and in the Mexican Foreign Service that there are not enough women in decision-taking positions. It's changing, but we are not yet there. And we have improved a lot at the Mexican Foreign Service, at the Mexican Foreign Ministry, but it is still a lot of resistance. It is still a lot of resistance, and one of the resistance comes that when we organize seminars on gender or on policies, is basically women that show up and not men. And it's men that we need to convince that a gender policy is necessary, because we are convinced. The problem is that a lot of men are not convinced that we need to have more women in decision-taking positions and participating. So I think that slowly but steadily we are going to this equity and gender parity, but we are still away from it. We're still.
That's true. But we will continue fighting on that. Larry, how do you see that in lawmaking positions?
So I sense that there may be a room full of Trump supporters here. That is concerning to me because I wouldn't want any of them to try to harm me based on the things I said. But the good news is that my life is protected today by Agnes Torres, who is over here. So I have two full-time security who protect my life, and I depend heavily on their decisions. The good news is that one of them is Agnes Torres. National Women's Day, by the way, Agnes.
Yes.
I mean, I think actually the district attorney's office in Philly are a little bit anomalous. Philly really is a special place. It's a really special place. The district attorney's office has more women than men, including among attorneys. It's a slight difference. I think it's about 52%, 48%. And if you actually go and look at the judiciary in Philadelphia, surprising though it may seem, I believe at this time we have more women than men, very slightly. My wife is a judge, in fact, in Philly, and she has been there for 19 years. It has not always been that way, but that is the way it is now. If you look at the senior management team in the Philadelphia DA's office, I have two first assistants. One is a woman, the retired Honorable Carolyn Engel-Temin, our very own version of RBG, we call her CET, who at the young age of 84 joined us and is just a fireball. I mean, she's just wonderful and doing a great job. And among the people who are supervising, which is not a permanent position in our office, it's very fluid, but among the people supervising, we have at least as many women as we have men. I don't know, I mean, I could speculate as to some of the reasons for this. This is not entirely uncommon. We just went on almost 2 solid months of recruiting all over the country for our next year's class of attorneys, and we hired about 60. Of them, slightly more than half are women. I could speculate. I think it may have something to do with the realities of trying to have a family and the nature of government work, or possibly that women are really drawn to certain aspects of the job. I'll put it that way. I don't want to guess because I'll say something dumb. But I think that is true within the office. Within the city, if you look at city council, we have some of the most powerful, important women. I mean, speaking of powerful, powerful in every sense of the word are in our city council. You have Maria Quinones Sanchez. You have, oh boy, I'm going to forget all the names. Sherelle Parker. You have Helen Kim. You have Janie Blackwell. You have very, very powerful people, and the two names most commonly bandied about for our next mayor are actually both women. So I do think that Philly's kind of a special place, and maybe it goes back to some of its origins and the good side of what Philly has been, both in terms of Constitution, Declaration of Independence, but also in terms of its Quaker history, sense of equality, that sort of thing. I think we're a special place, but of course there is a long way to go as well.
It's very Quaker.
Thank you. Yeah, Philadelphia, you can feel you can breathe the spirit of the Constitution here in Philadelphia, so that's nice. We have like 10 minutes to make questions. Just remember, a question finished with a question mark, so be brief and 10 minutes.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. My name is Yoshiaki Yamasaki. Happen to be one of the mental health providers that we work, particularly with youth cases, T visas, etc. There's something that I want to ask that is a policy issue that maybe we can actually solve in this room, that has to do with when women access or they're being interrogated at the district attorney's office, some cases get dismissed right there. They don't even go to court, even if they're trying. And it has to do with mental health issues. When a woman happens to be a victim of trauma, sometimes we go into denial, we go into a flat stage. This is general for men and women. And sometimes when they get interrogated, they're treated very, very poorly, because sometimes we treat them like if they were the criminal and not the victim. So they get victimized twice. But there's a policy here in Philly, or I don't know if it's a policy or existing policy or not, maybe you can help me, that actually dismisses the cases if the person that is being interrogated doesn't pass the muster with the district attorney's office. And we have cases with severe post-traumatic stress disorder that the person will not express their feelings, and if they see a flat face, they say, oh, she's not suffering. And so they dismiss the case. And so I applaud Ambassador in terms of making emphasis on the mental health part of it, but women still getting discriminated just by policy. Again, when we're looking at forensic examination, if the person happens to be darker skin, it gets less, the perpetrator gets less on their crime because the lesions are not so severe, because their dark skin will not show as much as a wet skin. So by science and by policy, we still discriminate women of color. So maybe we can do something about it. I guess it's not a question, but it's a question hopefully we can answer.
I'm sure he's taking note about this, Larry. Thank you so much. Another question over there, please. Question mark, remember, question mark.
Hi, my name is Laura Vargas. I'm a Vice Provost postdoctoral fellow here at the Injury Science Center, and thank you so much for the wonderful presentations. My question, and thank you so much, Consul Kerber, for your wonderful work. My question is related to communities, immigrant communities who are in rural areas. If you might be able to shed some light on what, from the perspective of the Mexican Embassy, from the perspective of the District Attorney's Office, how you are able to reach immigrants who are in rural communities and maybe even more vulnerable if they do not have a sanctuary city or policies to call upon. Thank you.
Well, I don't know that I'm the right one to address it, simply because my jurisdiction is only the city of Philadelphia. I could speculate about it, but I would rather defer to one of the wise participants other than myself if they feel like they'd like to answer it.
I will answer in a general manner, and maybe Alicia can complement with what we're doing in the area of the Consulate of Philadelphia. I think one of the practices that have helped us a lot is these consulados móviles and consulados sobre ruedas, so in which the consulates, they go to faraway places that are to really give services to the community that cannot come to the city because of different reasons. So the periodicity of these consulates, and it changes depending on the region. And there are consulates that really cover a small area, geographical area. There are consulates that cover huge areas. So what we are detecting is that even in some parts of the US in which we did not used to have Mexican communities, we are having larger Mexican communities, and a lot of them are in the rural areas because agriculture in many parts of the U.S. is totally dependent on immigrant workforce, both documented and undocumented. So let's say that our best tool is these consulados móviles, and unfortunately I do not have statistics on the number of protection cases that we can detect, and particularly on the situation of women in the rural areas, but maybe you have statistics for the Philadelphia's consulate, Alicia.
Yeah, we don't have it precisely, but for example, as Ambassador was telling, when we go to the consulate mobiles and we identify that there's a vulnerable community, specifically we have detected women in a specific situation, we try them to provide them with all the information. We have had cases when they are not the ones that talk, as Ambassador was also saying, like this Turkey situation where the man is the only one that talks. We can identify that maybe that woman is suffering from domestic violence, so we try to keep them apart, and we tell the husband, now we are going to talk about, I don't know, breast cancer or menstruation or whatever, and then the men just say, okay, that's not my topic, no? And in that moment we began to give them information, and they, maybe it's not the first time that we are going to see that woman, maybe that she's not going to react in that moment. We have had cases that we see a person like 5-7 times until she presents a complaint. But we have several programs, health programs, to provide them with all the services, and if you want specific numbers, we can provide them to you at the consulate. Here, sorry.
Yeah, hi. My name is Joanna Rodriguez. I'm from Baltimore. So it's the only rape crisis center in the city. And for over a year, I was the only Spanish-speaking therapist. So it's a lot to be dealing with, and with everything that's been happening in South Philly, we've had to return to knocking on doors to give out information. But the problem is a lot of people are afraid to open the door. So we were thinking of like how to get some kind of assistance and what we can tell our clients and the people on the street in terms of what are their rights when making reports, because it's not just sexual violence that they don't report, it's other crimes. But since we have the district attorney, I figured it would be a good idea to ask like what your recommendations are in terms of talking about safety with these people.
You're speaking of safety in reporting criminal activity. Well, you can certainly tell them this. You can tell them that the City of Philadelphia, the police department, and the DA's office have a very strong policy of protecting immigrants, of not informing ICE about the fact that a person is undocumented who is participating at any level in a case. That would be true. That is reality. But you also have to be honest with them, which is that the City of Philadelphia does not control ICE. We do not have the ability to prevent them from doing something that I wish they would not do, but on occasion do, which is coming to court or waiting outside of court and capturing people when they are leaving court. All that we can say is that in every way that the city can, we are going to make sure that a person's immigration status is not used against them in an inappropriate fashion. But the reality is, we are unable to control what the federal government does. I guess the encouraging part of that would be, however, their resources are quite limited. And one of the reasons that they're accessing the criminal justice system to try to find people, one of the reasons they wanted our data, which we won't give them, is because they don't have the resources just to spread out over the countryside and chase down undocumented immigrants. It is not actually all that hard to find undocumented immigrants. If you have an army to do it, they just don't have an army. So, I think that's a truthful and honest answer. It's not 100% encouraging, but I think it is the truthful and honest answer.
Thank you. We have the time over. We are going to have a moment to make a networking. Maybe you can approach our panelists, but first of all, I would like to thank all of you for being here. I appreciate Ambassador Barson and Ambassador Moreno. You have been role models for the women that are part of the Foreign Service in Mexico. Larry, thank you very much for making a space in your agenda and for the support that you give to the Mexican migrant community here. As we were telling, access to justice is something that needs to be faced from the human rights view. So it's important that this type of situations or the rights of women need not only one hemisphere of the brain working, we need both men and women working in behalf of human rights. So this day is to commemorate Women's International Day, but also to remember that we need to do more and move forward in order to guarantee human rights of women and better communities in the future. So thank you very much also to my team, my wonderful team, for being here. Thank you. I have the best team at the Consulate of Philadelphia. Now I will invite you to have a little lunch that we prepare. Well, no, that we have here. We didn't prepare anything. But you can reach Ambassador Moreno, Ambassador Barson, and Larry if he wants to stay a little bit with us. So thank you very much all. Gracias.
Good morning.